This is Dr. Mark Krause, and welcome to our class on the book of Ephesians for Hope International University. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the introduction to Ephesians and talking a little bit about the occasion for the book, the purpose for the book, and the argument that the book contains. Klein Snodgrass, one of our commentary authors, has said that pound for pound, Ephesians may be the most influential document ever written. In the opinion of Snodgrass, only Psalms, Romans, and the Gospel of John have been more important in the history of the church, but these are all much longer books. This course will look at this magnificent book in detail, finding much contemporary significance and value in its chapters. That said, it is not a simple or easy book to understand. We might note that except for a few favorite texts, it's not preached very much today. Our class will push us all to a deeper appreciation of this wonderful little book, and hopefully make it a lifelong tool and companion in our ministries. Now, just to give you an idea of what will happen in the class, some of the lectures are by me, Dr. Krause, but most of the lectures are by Dr. David Timms. And Timms is a former HIU professor. He now teaches at William Jessup University. And if you haven't listened to any of his yet, just let me warn you, you'll be able to tell when it's Timms instead of Krause. First, let's start with a little historical perspective on the book of Ephesians. And we need to talk just briefly about the authorship of the letter and whether or not Paul is truly the author. Let me just say that this will be discussed by Dr. Timms in the second lecture in much more detail. So for this opening lecture, we will assume Pauline authorship. Might note also that our commentary authors, Frank Thielman and Klein Snodgrass, both conclude that Paul is the author, and therefore we would say that the letter is authentic, an authentic letter of Paul. Let me say a word about Paul and the city of Ephesus. Now, Dr. Timms will talk more about the city itself and the nature of the city historically and culturally and socially in a later lecture, but what about Paul and this city? At the end of Paul's second missionary journey in the book of Acts, Paul visits Ephesus and he promises to return. This is in Acts chapter 18, verses 18 through 21. Paul at this time is wanting to get to Jerusalem, and he is under some type of vow that he has taken that we don't quite understand. But he apparently leaves his associates, Priscilla and Aquila, behind. They discover a man named Apollos, and they teach him Paul's doctrine, especially in regard to baptism. Apollos goes on to Corinth and apparently becomes the pastor or the preacher of that church in Paul's absence during this period. So then we have some things that go on, but very quickly Paul returns and goes on what we call his third missionary journey. And during this missionary journey, the third one, Paul has his longest located ministry that we know of in the book of Acts. And that is a time that he spends in Ephesus. We speculate that this may have been as long as 3 years. He's at least 3 months in the synagogue when he arrives, and then he spends 2 years, we're told, preaching out of the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This is in Acts chapter 19. We would date this somewhere approximately AD 52 to 55, in that ballpark, within a year or two. Paul's evangelistic efforts extend so that, we're told, all of the residents of Asia hear the gospel. Now, this doesn't mean that they go all the way to China. For them, Asia was a province of the Roman Empire that was located in southwest Turkey, what we would call Turkey today. But this indicates that there was a planting of many churches in the region, and that Ephesus was used as a base. It is during this time, when Paul is in Ephesus, that he writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We might notice 1 Corinthians 15:32. There Paul mentions fighting with wild animals at Ephesus. we don't know exactly what this means. Does it refer to his opponents, or is it to a time of imprisonment and maybe battle in an arena? It is probably the former, but there is some evidence that Paul was imprisoned part of his time in Ephesus. The several repeated elements characterize his ministry that we see repeated in Ephesus. He starts in a synagogue. This is in Acts chapter 19, verse 8. And by the way, in Acts, this is the last time Paul has contact with a synagogue directly. So he starts with the synagogue with his Jewish brothers. He is then rejected. This is in Acts 19:9. And he relocates with both Jewish and Gentile converts, and then the real work of the church begins. So apart from this general summary in Acts 19, verses 8, 9, and 10, Luke tells us of three main incidents that took place with Paul while he was in Ephesus. First, we're told the story of the rebaptism of a dozen converts of Apollos, apparently. We're intended to understand that they are his disciples. They're called disciples. He was just in Ephesus. He has already been identified in chapter 18, this is Apollos, as having a misunderstanding about baptism. And it's really quite interesting here. 20 years after Pentecost, there is still confusion, and maybe growing confusion about baptism. Well, why is this so important in Acts? These disciples only know, we're told, about John's baptism. And for the author of Acts, John's baptism does not involve the gift of the Holy Spirit. And so it is missing the greatest gift of the Christian life. That gift comes after correct baptism, is what we are shown. There is a baptism of these disciples, and then we have a miraculous display of tongues and prophesying. So first we have this incident with the converts, apparently of Apollos, that are rebaptized by Paul. Secondly, Paul's path is crossed by a traveling band of Jewish exorcists, and such groups are well attested in the ancient world. F.F. Bruce suggests that the tag, sons of a Jewish high priest named Sceva, is probably a commercial advertisement. In other words, it's just hype, because we know of no Jewish high priest named Sceva, so it seems to be a made-up sort of thing. But this story is important for two reasons in Acts. First, it shows the continued mastery of the Christian workers over the world of evil spirits. And this is a mastery that cannot be matched by anyone else, even by the Jews. And this actually is going to be a topic in the book of Ephesians. But also it leads to a community renunciation of magical practices, something that has been repeated on the mission field and even in this country in America. There is a public burning of magical books, which were sources of great power and very, very valuable. We are told that there are 50,000 silver coins. That's the value of these books, 50,000 silver coins, denarii. If we assume that a silver coin is the maybe daily wage of a common laborer in the ancient world, the purchasing power may have been somewhere in the neighborhood of perhaps a common wage today would be $100 a day. I know in some regions not that much, maybe not where you live, but in California maybe $100 a day would be a standard daily wage for a laborer. While 50,000 times 100 would mean that this bonfire was worth about $5 million. This is very impressive. But the third incident is the result of this mob action. In Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 41, really the rest of chapter 19, we find that this public renunciation of occult practices results in a turning away from idolatry. And that's a direct threat to the largest economic engine of Ephesus, the temple of Artemis. The mob is stirred for two reasons. The silversmiths in town, who make these little souvenir idols of Artemis, see this as an economic threat. but it's also seen as a threat to civic tradition and pride. Finally, though, we are told that in this riotous situation, civil order prevails. The town clerk quiets a potentially murderous situation, and for once the Christians receive quite a bit of respect from the pagan government. This is quite a contrast, by the way, with what just happened in chapter 18 in Acts with the Roman official Gallio in Corinth, who seems to not be interested in any kind of justice for the Christians. In chapter 20 in Acts, we get some farewell addresses by Paul, and this is his last contact, at least in this book, with the people of Ephesus. This is an indirect contact. He is on his way home at the end of the third missionary journey, but he agrees and arranges to meet with the Ephesian elders in a town called Miletus, and there he gives an impassioned plea for them to be vigilant and to protect their flock. So this is the last half of chapter 20 in Acts. Now, as I mentioned, the city of Ephesus itself will be covered by Dr. Timms in Lecture 3, but I want to talk a little bit about the church of Ephesus. Ephesus is associated with many books in the New Testament. We've already seen it in the book of Acts. It's obviously associated with Ephesians, but also with Colossians and Philemon. There is a connection we've already mentioned between Ephesus and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There is a connection between Ephesus and 1st and 2nd Timothy, because we believe that Timothy is in Ephesus for both of those letters when Paul writes to him. There is also a possible connection between 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and possibly the Gospel of John, because tradition is very strong that the Apostle John makes his way to Ephesus much after the time of Paul, and that's where these letters have their origin. That may also connect Ephesus to the book of Revelation directly, and in the book of Revelation, the city of Ephesus is mentioned. That means, if we count all these up, that as many as 13 of the books of the 27 books of the New Testament have a connection with the city of Ephesus. And so we see sometimes Rome or Jerusalem or maybe Antioch as the center of early Christianity, but in many ways it actually was the city of Ephesus. It's also interesting to notice the people that we know about in the New Testament that are associated with Ephesus. Over a dozen. We've mentioned Paul, we've mentioned Apollos, we've mentioned Priscilla and Aquila, who travel there with Paul from Corinth, and they stay behind when he goes on. We mentioned Timothy, who eventually becomes the pastor, and is there when Paul writes 1st and 2nd Timothy. We also would notice Gaius and Aristarchus, who are Macedonians, but are with Paul when he visits Ephesus. They are his companions in chapter 19, verse 29. And they, in fact, are the targets of the Ephesian crowd's fury in Acts chapter 19. We're also introduced to Tychicus and Trophimus, who are said to be from Asia in Acts chapter 20, verse 4, and probably Luke, the author of Acts, who at least seems to be present when Paul meets with the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20. We would also mention John Mark, who is mentioned in both Colossians and Philemon, and so he likely was in Ephesus at some time, and mentioned along with him is Demas, who is the one who deserts Paul according to 2 Timothy. We run into a man named Epaphras, who may have been the minister of the church in Colossae, but likely had strong connections with the people in Ephesus. And we've already mentioned John the Apostle, who probably writes the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and perhaps Revelation, although written on the island of Patmos. This was a prison colony just off the coast of Ephesus, and probably was delivered to Ephesus after it was written. There's also a very strong tradition that John, when he arrives in Ephesus, brings the mother of Jesus, Mary, and that she dies there. Now that's simply tradition. There's no way to know that for sure at this point. We should also say that the church in Ephesus was likely not a single congregation, but rather a network of house churches, probably no more than 20, maybe 30 folks in each house. How they were organized, we're not quite sure, but the letter was intended to be passed around among these house churches, and so it's often been called a circular letter. It likely circulated among these house churches in the city of Ephesus and in its surrounding region, but maybe even moving out into the other cities of the region. Let me say a little bit about the place of origin and the date of the letter. It is in the category in New Testament studies, we call it a prison epistle. These are also sometimes called the letters of the captivity or letters from prison. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon all make reference to Paul being imprisoned. In Ephesians and Philemon, he is specifically called a prisoner. In Philippians, in Colossians, and Philemon, he mentions being in bonds. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 20, he mentions being in chains. And it's interesting to notice that in 2 Timothy, he also mentions being imprisoned and in chains, but we don't usually consider 2 Timothy in this category of prison epistles. Now, in this group of four, then, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon stand together. In fact, Colossians and Philemon are inseparable. Of the 6 companions Paul sends greetings to in Colossians, 5 of them are mentioned in Philemon: Aristarchus, Mark, Epaphras, Luke, and Demas. And only a man named Justus occurs in Colossians and not in Philemon. Archippus is addressed in both Colossians 4:17 and in the first verse of Philemon. And we think that Tychicus is the bearer of both the book of Ephesians and Colossians. So these books, these three, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, really go together. Philippians is really quite a different book, and we don't have time to really talk about that here. But even though it's a prison epistle, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon go together very strongly. There's a lot of similarity of content between these two, especially between Ephesians and Colossians, and we'll see some of that as we walk our way through Ephesians. The question arises, though, is as to where Paul was and when this was, when he was in prison writing this letter. According to Acts, if we put dates on the events of Acts, about AD 58, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. This is in Acts 21:32. After 2 years of imprisonment, not in Jerusalem, but in Caesarea, this is Caesarea on the coast, Caesarea Maritima, and about a year-long voyage to Rome, he arrives there for his hearing before Caesar, and this would have been the emperor we know as Nero. This would have been about AD 60 or 61, and this is where Acts ends. It tells us that Paul is held there for 2 years. We presume, although Acts doesn't say this, that he is let out after the end of those 2 years. One of the theories is that they wait for 2 years for his accusers to come for his hearing before Caesar, and they never arrive. So Paul is probably released about AD 62 or 63. But this is the traditional time and place for the prison epistles, sometime between about AD 60 and maybe as late as 62 or 63. In an earlier book written in the 50s, 2 Corinthians, Paul actually claims to have been imprisoned many times, and this would have been before the time of his Roman imprisonment. We know of only 3 of these for sure. One, he was in jail overnight in Philippi. Probably not time to write many letters during that rather tumultuous little episode. He's also in Caesarea for about 2 years, and this would have been after 2 Corinthians, so it doesn't fit into that pattern in 2 Corinthians. And then he is in prison, or at least under a house arrest in Rome. We find that described in Acts 28:16. Since the time of Eusebius, the great church historian, about the 4th century, the early 300s to about AD 350, Eusebius has said that Rome has been defended as the origin for all the prison epistles, although a strong case has been made for Caesarea, and you will hear in the lectures from Dr. Timms occasionally, this is his position, that Ephesus was probably written in Caesarea. I disagree with him here, and he and I've had good discussion about this, and I think that the letter was probably written in Rome, so I would assume the traditional position. There is another possibility that it was written in Ephesus itself, and a great number of scholars hold that Philippians may have been written while he was under some type of arrest in Ephesus. This Ephesian captivity was first proposed by Adolf Diesmann in 1897, and it was claimed that 1st and 2nd Corinthians, usually thought to have come from Ephesus, actually have several veiled references to imprisonment. I don't know about that. A textbook that Dr. Timms used to use for this class, written by Ralph Martin, Ralph Martin thinks that Colossians and Philemon are from an Ephesian imprisonment. I think that's all pretty unlikely. Acts mentions no Ephesian imprisonment, and it would have been the type of thing that he would have mentioned, so I really doubt that.